And I was just thinking, so you pretty much were convinced by the comprehensible input theory from the get, right? Because you said you were already trying to convince teachers when you started, right? Was it because of your linguistic studies or your bilingual background, or why was that?
It started to happen as I got more and more involved in looking at what learners do with language over time. My MA thesis, for example, was on the acquisition of set and stat in Spanish. Those of you who don't speak Spanish, there's two verbs in Spanish that are like be. And in most contexts, they don't overlap. They have different functions. There's only a couple of contexts we can actually use both verbs, and you have to sort out why and so on. And so I was the first person to document stage and acquisition of how these verbs develop in learners over time as part of my MA thesis. And since then, there's been lots of work done. I continued that work. Other people continue that work. 2010, I wrote a review article in España, the journal that's published in the United States. If you want to look that up, it's, again, 2010. Summarizes what's going on with the acquisition of set and stat. But it was that initial work I did way back in my MA thesis that made me go, because I was smack in the middle of my studies and I didn't know, I have all my linguistics yet, I didn't have all my psycholinguistics yet, and so on. But it was looking at those patterns of development in learners that made me go, they are doing something to language completely independent of what's going on in their classrooms. By classrooms, I meant their textbooks and their, because in those days, learners were largely, it was learn your grammar and so on, but there was some conversation.
Right.
Excuse me. And the more I looked at what was going on, I could see that their language mechanisms were picking pieces and parts of stuff out of the communicative data they were getting in the classroom. As impoverished as it was there, right? Or readings they had in their textbooks. And they were constructing a system of set and stat over time that had nothing to do with what they were learning in textbooks. And I also noticed the following. One thing they were doing is they were also picking up chunks in the communicative input. So even though the earliest stages, for example, the first stage of the active set and stat, you'll see it in a lot of learners, is they just leave the verb out. So instead of saying, you know, Juan es alto, for example, you know, so John is tall, they say Juan alto. They just don't put a verb in, right? Or Maria no aquí, you know, that's how they say it in their Spanish one, they say Maria no aquí. So instead of saying Maria no está aquí, they would just say Mary not here. And so, but at the same time that they were doing that, you could see that they had a tenseless system without verbs, and the beginning of their language system was doing something independently. So but at the same time, they had chunks like "Cómo estás?" They had no idea what that was, but they knew that's how you asked how somebody was.
Right.
Right. So so I thought they're picking that out of the input as well. Some communicative interchange in the class. They're picking these chunks out that, you know, occur over and over and over again, and incorporating it as lexical items. So I saw grammatical stuff developing, and I saw chunks developing as like big lexical items. And that was when I first started to think about, they're pulling stuff out of the environment and doing something with it. And then along about that time, when Krashen first launched his input hypothesis in the late 70s. And so I was right there, you know, thinking about some similar things while he came along and did it. So by the time he started publishing his work and so on, and I saw it, I went, oh yeah, that's what I want to talk about. That's it. So, and then the more you get involved in looking at second language data from all different kinds of language, and you see these commonalities of what learners do, you go, yep, input, they're pulling stuff in the input.